Toronto. VK on the beat. Check. I'm in Toronto where you wanna get the city love. I'm from Toronto where you wanna get the city love. I'm in Toronto like we wanna get the city love. My city love me back for my city love.
Welcome to episode 1618, 1618 of Toronto Mic'd. Proudly brought to you by Great Lakes Brewery, a fiercely independent craft brewery who believes in supporting communities, good times, and brewing amazing beer. Order online for free local home delivery in the GTA. Palma Pasta. Enjoy the taste of fresh, homemade Italian pasta and entrees from Palma Pasta in Mississauga and Oakville. RecycleMyElectronics.ca. Committing to our planet's future means properly recycling our electronics of the past. Building Toronto's Skyline. A podcast and book from Nick Iones, from Fusion Corp. And Ridley Funeral Home, pillars of the community since 1921. Joining me today, making his Toronto Mic debut, is Allan Gregg. Welcome to Toronto Mic, Allan.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for being here. And I'm apologizing now that when you arrived, you had, naturally you had questions and we were having small talk. And I'm like, Allan, shut up. We're going to go live and do it all on the recording. So I don't mean to be short. I'm actually thrilled to have Allan Gregg here in the basement. That's where I pause for you to say, happy to be here and glad to make your dreams come true.
That and more.
That and more. So it's cold out there.
It's very cold.
So my wife, much like yourself, I'm going to ask you off the top about this, but my wife was born and raised in Edmonton, Alberta.
Great place to come from.
That's where the greats come from, right? We joke, like when days like this, a very rare day where I don't bike. I bike it 360 days a year. There's a handful of days where I say, oh, that weather is not bikeable. Today's one of those days. And I'll say, oh, like, this is crazy. And she'll be like, this was the norm in Edmonton. Is it like this often in Edmonton? Tell me if that's true.
I just had my 73rd birthday, January 14th, which typically was the coldest day of the year
Happy birthday, buddy.
In Edmonton. And when I was about 16, I told my mom and dad, no more January 14th birthdays. We're going to have it on May 15th. But I, like all kids in the prairies, played hockey, outdoor rinks, and I can remember the toughest guy on the team crying his eyes out because his toes and his ears were frozen. Yeah. Typical.
It can hurt, right?
Yes.
This is a painful cold.
Minus 40, you have no frame of reference to understand that until you've lived it.
Throughout this convo, I'll be reading notes that came in from listeners who are excited you're here. Tim Heron wrote in to say, ask Allan about growing up in Edmonton. So right off the top, tell me a little bit about where you come from. Like, when did you leave Edmonton? Why do you leave Edmonton? Bring me back to the chilly confines of Edmonton, Alberta, Canada.
Well, I was born and raised just outside of Edmonton in Jasper Place, an unamalgamated town that, as Edmonton grew, became part of Edmonton. My dad sold suits at Eaton's, went from the time he was 21 till he died at 64. My mother was a homemaker who only wanted to be a mother, had 2 biological children, adopted 3 more. It was an idyllic time. I mean, you don't want to sound like a nostalgic old fart, but you really did believe that if you worked hard and put your mind to it, you could be anything you want. And you, my child, had the right to expect more than I had. And a good education was the key to success in the future. And that you had an experience that more or less corresponded to those beliefs. Like everyone in Alberta, unless you got the Rhodes Scholarship and went to Oxford, right. You went to University of Alberta. You didn't even think about going to UBC.
Well, that's where my wife went.
You didn't even think.
Alberta.
If you lived on a farm, you went in residence. And if you didn't, you lived in your mom's basement until you graduated. Then you got married the next day. So that was kind of the life that was expected, and that was the life that was lived.
I like how you use the term nostalgic old fart. And I was thinking, do you know where you are, Allan? This is the home of nostalgic old farts. Toronto Mic'd here. I love the nostalgia.
Quite the opposite. One of the reasons I'm here is because most of my adult and professional life, I felt very confident about understanding what's happening in the socio-political culture. And I feel much less confident today than I really ever have. And thought that, Allan, you've really got to get out there and interact more. Meet people like Toronto Mic, meet his audience, and start figuring things out a little bit better.
Well, let me ask you a little bit about that because we were connected by an FOTM. FOTM means Friend of Toronto Mike. You're now an FOTM, Allan Gregg.
There you go.
And for the listenership, not to be confused with cuddly FOTM, Allan Greggo. Although you both spell Allan the same way. Greggo and Greg, two different last names, two different human beings. Although I'm sure you're cuddly as well.
Try to be.
Okay, so we're connected because FOTM Jesse Hirsch was telling me that he had some combos with you lately, and he's like, Allan Gregg, firstly, when I started podcasting, I remember distinctly, early days, we're going back 12 years or so, that my podcast, I would be, oh my God, I'm in the top 10 on Apple Podcasts. Like, oh, I think it was like iTunes back then. And I'm like, this is kind of cool. But I would always see a TVO podcast there. Allan Gregg, like you had a TVO podcast that would be right beside me in the early days of Toronto Mike. Then I'd be like, I got to target this. I got to get this guy in the basement at some point. Many years later, here you are.
There you go. No, 19 years on TVO. And it was a serious hobby. It wasn't a full-time gig. I always had other things going on. But I had a great team in terms of producer and a researcher. And that we interviewed some of the smartest people in the world, uninterrupted by commercial breaks.
Right.
And, you know, I learned very, very early on, the producer said, you know, no one's going to turn this on to hear the questions you ask. They're going to turn this on to hear the answers your guests get. So this isn't about you, buddy. And your job is to make sure these guys come across, and women come across, as smart as they can be.
Like you're there to extract the interesting tales that they have to tell. Like you're there to just extract this content for your listenership.
Oh, absolutely. And we had people, everyone from Jane Goodall to Salman Rushdie to Boris Johnson to Jean Chrétien, and I think we over had 1,000 guests.
So a couple more questions, only because this show is in spirit very similar to the show you're on right now in some guy's South Etobicoke basement, which tells you how things have changed. But please tell me, like, how long would these conversations run?
Usually, typically around, they edited it down to 30 minutes, but they would go 45, 50 minutes.
And I'm curious, I know that, TV Ontario, of course, old stalwart. Shout out to FOTM Steve Paikin, who's hopefully, at home listening. By the way, Tim Herron, the same guy who wanted me to ask you about growing up in Edmonton, wanted to tell you that he absolutely loved your TVO show. He said it was similar to Steve Paikin's show, but you were a great interviewer. So kudos from Tim on your TVO show.
Well, thank you, Tim. Very nice.
But I'm curious, did you ever consider at the time, like, oh, I just had a chat with Jane Goodall, I'm making it up here, for 52 minutes. Do we need to edit this down to a half an hour? Maybe this is a 52-minute experience where you're a fly on the wall while Allan Gregg talks to Jane Goodall.
Well, that's the luxury that you have. I mean, one of my guilty pleasures, I have for decades, loved Howard Stern.
Sure.
And he's evolved into a great, great interviewer.
Right.
Probably injects himself a little bit too much into the conversation. But part of his greatness is that he has got this kind of very elastic format that lets him go an hour and a half with his guests, and he gets to places that you can't. I mean, I also did the At Issue panel on CBC for decades, and every Thursday night before we went on air, the producer would say, "Be brief." And I think, well, why would we be brief? I mean, you can't sustain an hour of television anyway. What do you want to get to Chirpy the Squirrel in Cape Breton Island, or how to put 2 cars in a 1-car garage?
Right.
And there always was this notion of brevity, and that brevity can be the enemy of enlightenment. There's no question.
And what I've learned, only doing this 1,618 times, is often the good stuff comes at like the 45-minute mark, because it takes some time to build. Like, we've never met each other before.
To build a relationship, and also to get your guests to have their guard down a little bit, because most
100%.
people come in with their little soapbox.
Right.
They've got a little agenda that they want to advance.
Yeah.
And the agenda isn't necessarily very interesting. It's interesting to the guests, but not necessarily to the audience.
So your job, in a sense, is almost to get them off script. I find this a lot, particularly if I do it with politicians, actually. We'll talk more about this in a minute. But I find that you really do kind of, like, you need to talk. Let's talk a little bit about Edmonton, and maybe there's a tangent there where you tell me your hero was Bobby Orr, and we talk about, how you feel about, Bobby Orr and recent development. And then we kind of get off there. And then when we come back, you've got a sense of comfort. You've kind of let your guard down. Maybe you kind of dropped the talking points memo that you were handed from your advisor or something, and now you can have a conversation with this human being.
Absolutely.
Okay, we're singing from the same songbook here. Okay, so again, few hits here. I know where I want to go. If you have any questions, I know you had some questions, and I said, Allan, let's do it on the recording. So you can bug me about anything as we go here. Since
Well, let me do that because I mean,
Go ahead.
I've watched your podcast, loved the two Charlie Angus interviews. You
yeah, it was
did.
last Monday.
Thought they were exceptional, both when he was advancing his the grievous angel, and the second
Right.
time he came on as the grievous devil. But really, really insightful into a guy who most people don't really know that well, and member of Parliament from Northern Ontario, and big deal, New Democrat, real predictable. None of those things. Really insightful.
And what I like about him is that when you invite him over, because the first time, my rule, and I'm curious what you think of this rule. Maybe this is a bad rule, but it's my personal rule because this is all really, I'm my own target audience here. But I have never pursued an active politician in the 12 or 13 years I've been doing this. Like, so when I mean by active, somebody who's still in public office. Like, if someone in public office comes on Toronto Mic'd, they've reached out, like their people, or they have, or their handler, or whatever. Somebody has said, hey, would you talk to this person? And then when I get that request, which has happened a few times, like it happened with Stephen Del Duca, it's happened with Brad Bradford, it's happened a few times. I'll consider, like, do I want to talk to this person? Sometimes I say no, thank you. And sometimes I say, yeah, I'll have that chat. But I've never initiated a chat like that. So Charlie Angus, Jason Schneider, I think, was helping him publicize the Grievous Angels music. And he's like, would you talk to Charlie about Grievous Angels? And I'm like, well, 100% I'll talk to Charlie Angus, but about whatever I want. Like, I mean, Grievous Angels, I'll load it up and we'll definitely talk Grievous Angels, but I'm going to like chat with him about other things too. And he's like, yeah, of course. And then Charlie just sort of, he drives himself. He sits down here. We talk for like an hour. I don't edit a stitch. He knows that. I don't know if he knows it or not, but I don't edit a stitch. I throw it out there. And then now that we have this rapport and he's now an FOTM because his people asked, or someone asked if he could come on, I now have this connection where I can be like what happened last 2 Sundays ago, where I wrote him. I was wearing this Trump thing in this 51st state. I was wearing it. Like, Allan, was bugging me. Like, I don't know, is it bugging you at all? Like, what are your thoughts on the Trump threats to annex our sovereign nation?
Oh, listen, like everyone else. I mean, anyone else who's sentient, I'm, very concerned and very confused too. And this goes to what I said earlier, wanting to interact a little bit more than I have been in the last 5-6 years. Guys like Jesse Hirsch, who I talk to every week as a matter of course. He's one of the most brilliant techno-cultural anthropologists. He just sees stuff that most people don't see. And my relationship with him goes back, some 20 years. And I remember, in golfing, of all things, this is how we started a relationship, golfing, and being on the golf course, and him saying, you know what, I think that the iPhone is going to surpass BlackBerry in terms of market share. And I said, that's impossible. This is when everyone had a BlackBerry. Everyone had a BlackBerry.
Of course.
And he said, no, it's all going to be about software, not hardware. And I just kind of dismissed it. And then next year, iPhone surpassed BlackBerry, and BlackBerry's dead now.
BlackBerry, shout out to Ridley Funeral Home.
But something else you said I think is very interesting.
Yeah.
Temper of our times, that politicians want to come to you now.
Yeah,
and
that's true.
that is not, when I was managing politicians,
Yeah.
you wanted to control the environment all the time.
Right.
And again, I talk about Howard Stern. I mean, he went on great lengths that Hillary Clinton made a massive mistake in 2016, not going on his show because she did not want to expose herself to an uncertain environment. Sure. And then she went on after she was defeated and admitted that was the case. And this is, when politicians, when they've lost faith in politicians and you conclude there are no great men or women left, what you're really looking for is authenticity. And authenticity, requires honesty. And it means letting yourself get bare naked and coming on to see Toronto Mike. And that wouldn't happen when I was actively involved in managing politics.
Well, we're gonna cover all this. This is almost the preamble here still, and we will get back to Jesse Hirsch. I have more questions about that. But to finish my Charlie Angus thing here is that it was Sunday, just 2 Sundays ago, and I was wearing this rhetoric, the fact that people were kind of, mainstream media seemed to be taking it on some sort of face value where they were having segments like shows I respect. And I know somebody who's going to hate hearing this, but shows I respect were talking about like, what would it look like if Canada joined the USA? Like they were having panels with important people would be having these conversations. It was really, I was wearing it. And I reached out to Charlie Angus, who was already at FOTM. And I just said, Charlie, I need to talk to you, but I'm not Zooming with you. It has to be in my basement. And meanwhile, I'm talking to a guy who lives in like Timmins, James Bay. Like he's not popping over, whatever. And he's like, I can be there tomorrow morning. Like I'm like, oh, what? Okay, I said let's do it. 10:30 tomorrow. And he was at the door by himself, and he sat down and we chatted for 45 minutes or so, and it was great. And so thank you for listening to that episode. And I really enjoyed chatting with a guy like Charlie Angus.
Well, and he's given up his office, his position in Parliament. But I mean, your interview with him, especially the second one, made it absolutely clear he has no interest in giving up in politics. In fact, he's going to become a real politician now, unfettered by public office and all of the things, party discipline and everything else. And
you know what I felt after the convo? I felt like he's making a mistake. He should change his mind. He should run. He should win, and he should pursue leadership of the federal NDP party.
Again, I mean, the difficulty in parliamentary democracy and party discipline, and I mean, look at the amount of time that the leaders have to spend, cajoling and catering to
right.
that caucus. This is a guy who is truly independent thinker, right. And that's what we need. I mean, you talk about Donald Trump. Most of us have no frame of reference to understand how a guy who the Washington Post has documented lying 32,000 times
right.
during his first term could be reelected. Well, what you've got right now is a population that is forming its decisions, its attitudes, using completely different dimensions than they have in the past. And those who are wedded to those past dimensions have no frame of reference to understand why those decisions are being made today.
Like how are these decisions being made? Like I sit here again, different country, different everything. I didn't have a vote and I'm sitting here and I'm like, oh, they decided to run that guy back. Like they're going to give this guy like a carte blanche to go again. And it doesn't compute in my feeble little brain. But again, I can't think like somebody, I don't know, someone in the Rust Belt. I just can't. Can you help me understand how it is they gave a blank check to Donald J. Trump to be president again for 4 more years?
Well, one of the reasons we don't have a frame of reference, Gwynne Dyer said something hilarious and really insightful a long time ago. He says, Canadians have no frame of reference to understand America because half of America is exactly like Canada. Boston is just like Toronto. He says the other half is exactly like Tehran. It's backwards, it's right. religiously focused, right. and we have no frame of reference to understand Biloxi because there's nothing. Red Deer is not like Biloxi. It is completely unusual. And to your earlier reference, making Canada the 51st state, I mean, what would happen first is there would be 2 more Democrats in the Senate. There would be 30 more Democrats in the House of Commons because Canadians, almost by definition, I said a long time ago, and this also still holds, even in the changed times that we're in, is that they would have elected Aristotle as the prime minister because they love the golden mean. I asked a very, very simple question not that long ago. I said, when you think about how you view politics, would you describe yourself as very right-wing, somewhat right-wing, in the middle, somewhat left-wing, or very left-wing? And only 13% of Canadians had themselves in the end zones. 7% said I'm extremely left-wing, 6% said I'm extremely right-wing. The plurality, almost 40%, said I'm in the center. And the unhappiness electorally was that the center felt least represented by the political process, that the system was much more polarized than the electorate is. So, but, when I say we don't have the kind of or we're wedded to a way of viewing the world that is completely different now. I'll give you just one very, very simple example.
Yeah.
Huge dimension right now in political choice is optimism and pessimism. You talked about growing up in Alberta in the 50s and 60s. Everyone was optimistic because the future was optimistic because the future was going to be better than the past. And this was a universally held view. In 2016 exit polling in the United States election, single best predictor of presidential voting behavior was not age, was not ethnicity, was not urban rural. It was to a question to, do you believe the best times are ahead of America or the best times are behind America? 80% of Trump voters said they're behind us. 80% of Clinton voters said they're before us. So here you've got a population. The polarization isn't so much ideological, but lived experience. The people who believe that the past was better, it's not surprising. There were no transgender toilets there, that they're against transgender toilets. That women, stayed in the kitchen and baked cookies. So, who wants nasty feminists? And so you've got a different dimension at work now. Trust in the system. Trust, and why the system, I'm not just talking about politicians, I'm talking about science. These were never issues, and now these are major demarcations and dividing points in outlook.
Yeah, so I'm going to follow that thread there and ask you a question. And then we are going to do a little bit of a chronological walkthrough because I have these key questions. Because there's a lot of meat on your bones there. There's a lot here that interests me, and I'm like, okay, I could do, for example, I could do 90 minutes right now on working with Jay Gould and managing the Tragically Hip. Like I would enjoy doing that. But there's so much more meat on the bones. But my question for you as a conservative strategist, we'll talk about that, key part of your career in a moment. But why is anti-trans legislation such a high priority and so key to the to Trump's administration here?
Well, again, I talk about not understanding the dynamics that are at work here. You look at the transition of blue collar workers from the Democratic Party to the
Pun
Republicans.
intended.
And you're seeing that right now. Pierre Poilievre has been able to capture blue collar workers. Doug Ford has been able to capture blue collar workers, because progressives, in search of social justice for all the right reasons, moved past class politics to identity politics, believing that really what they had to focus on for social justice was those people who were most discriminated against in society, independent of their financial well-being, had to be advanced. And in advancing them, the blue-collar workers said, no one's talking to me. 20 years ago, Thomas Rich wrote a book called What's the Matter with Kansas, where he said, I don't understand this. These are Kansas wheat farmers voting Republican. The Republican Party is the party of Wall Street. So he went there and he said, why are you voting Republican? He said, well, because the Democrats look down their nose at us. They care way more about Steven Spielberg and David Geffen and transgender toilets than they do about the price of wheat, and just felt left behind and abandoned. And that's a big dynamic at work right now.
True, but very puzzling from where I sit, just because they've decided their fearless leader would be Donald Trump, who to me is the last guy who would be of the farmers and the blue collar workers.
And absolutely. How about evangelical voters?
Right.
He got 90% of the evangelical votes. This guy is the tantamount sinner.
Yeah, children with three women
that we've ever seen.
Right.
Grab them by the pussy.
Right.
He's just a horrible, horrible human.
Yeah, just the worst person. Like, I wouldn't want to go grab a Great Lakes beer with Donald Trump.
No, but because if you believe that all politicians are corrupt, then you don't differentiate between
scorch the earth.
Absolutely, this guy is at least going to stop
agent of chaos
and stop abortion.
Right. Stop abortion and get rid of this. I was at Second City to watch FOT and Bob Willett do a thing on Friday night on there, and they had two washrooms. Okay, so I hadn't been. It's a new facility because I had to move. I'm at the Second City. This is One York, and two washrooms, and both said non-gender specific or some terminology like that. So there is no men's room and women's room like you get at a Swiss Chalet or something. Okay, but they had on it. One said stalls. The other said stalls plus urinals.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So I want a urinal. I know where I'm going, which is like, so, but I thought, okay, so this base that you mentioned, we mentioned Trump and we mentioned Pierre Poilievre and Doug Ford, this base that they sort of appeal to, they wouldn't like that, right? Like they want a men's room and a woman's room.
But this is part of the zero-sum society. There's no contradiction be having transgender toilets and selling wheat. Because you do one doesn't mean you can't do the other. And because you do one, it doesn't mean you can't do the other. Yet these are the kind of choices that our politicians are saying you must make, and the electorate, confused, dismayed, feeling left behind, fall in that trap.
Fascinating. And now I'm going to establish you as why you'd be an interesting guy to get an opinion on this. And then maybe I'll ask you this question first, and then we're going to go back because I got a question from Fred Waterer, which I think is interesting. But do you think Pierre Poilievre and possibly also Doug Ford would read from this playbook and say, hey, anti-trans is how is red meat for our base. Let's go in that direction. Do you think anti-trans rhetoric will make their way into the political sphere here in Canada?
No, absolutely not. And that is because, as I say, Canadians are not in the end zones. They are not extremists by almost definition and by nature. I mean, the foundation of the country is counter-revolutionary. That we have had an ethos that we have to get along English and French. And these sort of things have been imbued into our culture. In fact, there's an argument that Canada may be the only country in the Western world where conservatives would not reopen gay marriage, capital punishment, transgender issues, abortion, and until very, very recently, immigration. And even there, I mean, there still is an underlying sense that we are a nation of immigrants, and that has been a good thing, not a bad thing.
But Allan, what about your home province, the province that produced my wife? What about Alberta?
Well, again, Angus Reid just did a very interesting piece, and he just said, do you believe that the rest of Canada respects your province? And Alberta, far and away the lowest, only 23%. And again, that sense of grievance, that sense of alienation produces, attitudes that say, well, if you don't like me, I don't like you.
Right. If the goal was to somehow make Toronto Mike...
But even, sorry, just to finish.
Yeah, no, you finish.
Look at the mayors of Edmonton and Calgary. These are supposed to be hairy-ass cowboys, and their mayors are incredibly progressive. Now, that's not Carstairs, Alberta. The rural area is very, very different. Urban-rural is a big, big variable of divide right now in cultural politics.
I do wonder if you had a referendum state by state. Hey, you want to join the U.S. of A? I think every state, did I say state by state? I meant, that's a Freudian slip. Somebody write that down. But province by province, I suspect every province would in this referendum would say, no, we're Canada, we're a sovereign nation, we don't want to be a part of the USA. I'm not so sure about Alberta.
No, they would also say.
Promise?
There's more sympathy.
Well, you know something about
Alberta.
referendums. We're going to get to that in a minute here.
But no, and someone described Canadian identity as the narcissism of small differences. I mean, we look in the mirror of America, and we define ourselves in terms of what we don't see.
Right.
And so Americans are intolerant. We are tolerant.
Right.
They are warlike. We are peaceful.
Right.
They are selfish. We are charitable. And that's the foundation of our identity, and it's important, and that's why no one really takes the Trump notion of let's annex Canada as the 51st state seriously.
And one last note on that, because I haven't even got to where I want to get to. My goodness, it's fascinating talking to you. We might need a sequel or two here. But one last note on that. I suspect when I hear 51st state, what my brain does is it sort of converts that to, no, like whatever Puerto Rico is, that's what, you know what I mean? So 51st state isn't happening.
No.
But if I feel like they would definitely, and this is why I wonder, like, if you, and I said this to Charlie Angus, but if you want us to be a part of your country, roll the fucking tanks now. Like, you're right. I'm going to grab my hockey stick, get my boys, my girls, and we're going to be at the border. But you're going to have to use military force is what I'm saying. And I know at the end of that story, Trump has no interest in making Canada the 51st state.
No.
We will be in the Puerto Rico category. And I even forget, what is it called again? Colony? What is a Puerto Rico category?
It's I don't
whatever
even
that
know.
is.
Yes.
Whatever that is. I know they don't get the vote federally.
It's an anachronism is whatever it is. The whole colonialism.
More bullshit. Okay. So Fred Waterer writes in about you, Allan. Fascinating guy. Well, he thinks you're fascinating. He spoke at an Ontario Tory campus club conference I attended in 1980, long before he was well known. I was not surprised to see his later success. He's even in my library. After the Great Schism in 1993, I chose not to embrace the Reform Alliance CPC. So this is somebody obviously was a progressive conservative supporter who did not become what we now call the Conservative Party of Canada. But this is a good gateway. I'd like to know a little bit about this part of your career before I get to the Tragically Hip and Jake Gold. But
sure,
you were a Tory strategist. Tell me how that came to be and what you were doing for the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada.
Like many people, I mean, the big part of the path was fortuitous circumstance. I was happily doing a PhD at Carleton University. As one of the wonders of modern family planning, my late wife announced that she was 5 months pregnant. We were destitute. I had to get a job. My history advisor said, well, I know a guy who's going to get a job as the head of parliamentary research, which was kind of it was funded by the Library of Parliament to do policy research for the opposition. At that time, the opposition were the Progressive Conservative Party under Robert Stanfield. So I went for an interview, and the guy said, Why do you want to work for the Progressive Conservative Party? And I'd never cast a consistent vote in my life at that time. I wanted to be a professor. I wanted to be an academic. And I said, well, I really don't give a shit about the Progressive Conservative Party, but I care deeply about parliamentary democracy, and the foundation of a strong parliamentary democracy is a healthy, vibrant opposition. And the extent that I could help you kick the shit out of the Liberal Party and the government, I'd be happy to do it. And he hired me. And just one thing led to another. By the time I was 25, I was the national campaign secretary of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Wow.
And by the time I was 27, I started Decima Research, which was really the first public affairs research company that focused on politics in the country.
Okay, very, very cool. Now, you also went to work for the Republican Party?
No, my first partner was Dick Wirthlin.
Okay.
And Dick Wirthlin, his claim to fame when I met him was he was the pollster for the governor of California. It was Ronald Reagan. And by the time we started Decima in 1979, he was working the 1980 presidential election. And he went from being my partner to the pollster to the president of the United States, and didn't have much interest in Canada anymore, understandably. And myself and two other guys bought him and Foster Advertising, who'd put up the money to start Decima, out in 1981.
Okay. So to be specific, in 1984, there's a federal election in this country, and the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada, led by Brian Mulroney, the late Brian Mulroney. What role exactly did you play in that election?
Well, I had done federally both the 1979 and 1980 election. Won the 1979 election, lost the 1980 line. One of the headlines goes, Allan Gregg goes from whiz kid to was kid. So it was a little humiliating. But I did the 1981 provincial election that restated Bill Davis back into a majority seat, and was a great supporter of Joe Clark. I mean, I really like Joe Clark as a person.
Joe who?
Joe Clark. That's exactly the headline in the Ottawa Citizen when he won the leadership at the age of 38 in 1976. But I came to really like him as a human being. He was just a good guy. I remember going into his office, and it was 1977, and there was a convention that the Conservatives were having in Quebec City. And they had a leadership review back then. And, leadership review, if they vote against you, you're out. And I went to talk to him because I had done studies of delegates about what his situation was there. And he said, I'm not really interested in that. It'll be all right. He said, one of the things I really want to do is I want to make sure that new Canadians have a much higher profile in this convention. And me thinking at one and the same time, you knucklehead, I'm here to talk about your existential future here. You might get kicked out of the party. But what a good human being that you're more concerned about the lack of ethnic representation in the Progressive Conservative Party in the late 1970s. So I was a huge supporter of his. 1983, the leadership review comes out, and he only gets 60%. He says there's going to be a campaign. I'm very much behind him, and he loses. Brian Mulroney wins. Brian Mulroney really doesn't like me. He doesn't like me, first because I'm a supporter of Joe Clark, but also I'm not very fond of him either, because he's not my kind of guy, and I'm not his kind of guy. I mean, I do not like hail fellow, well met, big blustering bullshitters.
Well, let's describe your persona at the time. I'm looking at a pretty cool cat right now. What are you, 72, you said?
73.
73, okay. But, I mean, I've seen photos of you back then. You didn't really look like a conservative strategist.
No, I had hair down to the middle of my back and earrings and tattoos on my arms and wore red shoes and leather pants.
Like, it's possible Mulroney's can't see past that.
No, and that's very, very true, because that's the kind of guy he was. I mean, he would tell other people, he says, I don't understand that Allan Gregg. He could be so much more successful than he is, if he
Get a haircut.
Exactly. And he just thought I was a friggin' weirdo.
Right.
And so while I think over time, because I was his chief strategist and pollster in 1984, and then again in 1988, he came to respect me, and I came to respect him as a politician. But neither of us really enjoyed each other's company or thought each other was soulmate. I said one time, very uncharitably, I said, I can live with him, but I wouldn't go on a tenting vacation with him.
Well, it's interesting, he glad he could tolerate you for the 84 and the 88 election. Huge majorities for the Progressive Conservative of Canada.
Yeah, and well, he had his eye on the ball all the time. In fact, when the Airbus scandal came, I remember Trish Woods, who's a reporter following it, telling me this. And I said, Trish, that can't be true. This guy is just way too Machiavellian to throw his career away and his legacy away for $375,000. And clearly I was wrong.
So at the time, because I'm going to pull a clip from a debate between John Turner and Brian Mulroney in a moment here. You could probably guess which one. But what were your thoughts back then on negative campaigning, and have they evolved since the 80s?
Well, yeah, they have. We were one of the first to really start negative campaigning. I don't know if you're going to get to 1993 when I
of course
destroyed a national institution.
Going a little chronological here, but yeah.
But yeah, because I mean, the reason is cynicism rose, and it was starting to rise really in the early 1980s. The trust in government was going, trust in politicians was going down and down and down. And so if you say, my guy is a really good guy, that doesn't have as much credibility as saying their guy is a crook. And so negative advertising not only is usually more effective because the communications is clear, the comprehension of what is being said is more understood. It's also more credible because it's going to people's negative instincts. That said, it's toxic. And having been a pioneer in this area, I also gave a speech to the Carleton Journalism Organization saying that, look, if I was McDonald's, I could get market share from Burger King by saying they have botulism. And Burger King could probably get market share back from me by saying that McDonald's promotes E. coli in their things. And it would work short term. But over time, what would happen is that no one would eat a hamburger again. And that's what we're doing in politics. The more we go after the enemy, the more we degrade the space. And the more we degrade the space, the more cynical the electorate becomes, and the less receptive they become to a positive argument and a positive message.
Okay, let me play a little clip here. So you'll hear it in the headphones, just about 90 seconds from a debate.
Sure.
I happen to believe that you've sold us out. I happen to believe that once you...
Mr. Turner, just one second.
Once any
you
nation...
do not have a monopoly on patriotism. And I resent the fact that your implication that only you are a Canadian. I want to tell you that I come from a Canadian family and I love Canada. And that's why I did it, to promote prosperity. And don't you impugn my motives.
Economic levers.
Don't you impugn my motives or anyone else's.
Once a country yields its energy.
We have not done it.
Once a country yields its agriculture.
Wrong
Once
again.
a country opens itself up to a subsidy war with the United States
Wrong
on
again.
terms of definition, then the political ability of this country to sustain the influence of the United States to remain as an independent nation, that is lost forever, and that's the issue of this election.
Mr. Turner, I today, sir, as a Canadian, believe genuinely in what I am doing. I believe it is right for Canada. I believe that in my own modest way, I am nation building because I believe this benefits Canada and I love Canada.
We built a country, east and west and north. We built it on an infrastructure that deliberately resisted the continental pressure of the United States. For 120 years, we've done it with one signature of a pen. You've reversed that, thrown us into the north-south influence of the United States, and will reduce us, I'm sure, to a colony of the United States, because when the economic levers go, the political independence is sure to follow.
Mr. Turner, with a document that's cancelable on 6 months' notice, be serious.
Look.
Be serious.
Cancelable. You're talking about our relationship with the United States. Once that
commercial document that's cancelable on 6 months' notice.
Commercial document.
That document relates to treaty.
It relates to every facet of our life. It's far more important to us than it is to the United States, sir. Far more important.
Please be serious.
Well, I am serious. I've never been more serious in my life.
Please.
What are your thoughts listening to that again in the headphones, Allan Gregg?
Well, first, I mean, the emotion and passion. I mean, you don't see that often. But it was a telling time. I mean, we'd done lots of research on presidential debates, which have been going on, as you know, since the 1960s. They were much less frequent in...
a sweaty Nixon.
But normally they don't make any difference, certainly not in the moment, because of confirmation bias. People basically see what they want to see. So if you like one Mr. A, you think Mr. A did better. And if you like Mr. B, they say Mr. B did better. Both the 1988 campaign and the 1984 campaign had knockout punches that made a huge difference. In 1984, when Brian Mulroney turned to him and said, "You, sir, had an option," when he had, put forward a number of patronage positions. And here, where John Turner, by virtue of his passion, convinced people that our entire cultural identity, our social programs were at risk through the free trade agreement, we saw an immediate shift both times, literally the next night in our nightly polling.
So to give a little, so for the youngsters listening who don't remember the late 80s, I was there, I remember, but still too young to vote, actually. But what? Tell us about this with the free trade debate, and interesting that when I listened to that clip yesterday, thinking about the current state and how our sovereignty seems to be at the greatest threats we face since 1812. Okay, before we were even a country. What when you hear those words, I wonder. Can you tell us a little bit about that moment with free trade and what was happening with the United States of America?
Sure.
And how these words kind of apply to 2025 and what's happening now.
Well, the Conservatives had negotiated a free trade agreement. And, for all of Brian Mulroney's opportunism, I never said, what would be really good, Brian, here is why don't you introduce a goods and service tax? Why don't you open up the Constitution and have a big fight about what Quebec's role in the country? Why don't you have a free trade deal with the United States? None of these were things that the population was looking for. So this kind of came out of nowhere for most people. And that by and large, the attitude was, it's probably all right. You got about 65% of the population supporting free trade, the free trade agreement. But that support was not strong and it wasn't deep. And we also knew from the more qualitative work we had done is that the benefits of free trade were long-term and abstract. You become more productive and you trade more goods. Well, did we trade a lot today or a little bit? I really don't know. I don't have a frame of reference. Whereas the liabilities were immediate and tangible. We're going to lose our cultural identity. We'll not have any more CanCon on our music. That our healthcare system will be in peril. And what John Turner was able to do in that debate is bring those liabilities home. And in no small measure because his passion. People said, this guy really worries about this free trade agreement, that this is going to be bad for Canada, it's going to be bad for identity, it's going to be bad for the differences that Canadians continue to husband and hold to this day in 2025. So it was the first time I'd ever seen, and I think the first time that had certainly happened in Canada, and only time in Canada, where you saw a trend reverse itself twice, is that the Conservatives went up in the early parts of the campaign. They went down after this debate, and they were able to recover and win in the 1988.
What was the bridge bombing attack on John Turner?
Oh, John Turner, to the day he died, hated me for that. And every time he saw me, you see the darts coming out of his eyes. Well, I said, look, I explained first, this is what had happened, is that the ground had shifted. We didn't want to run an election on free trade for that very reason. And now it's shifted. It is the issue, and the issue is about these liabilities. And people believe that these liabilities might come to pass because John Turner believes it, because of his passion and emotion. So I said the bridge between support for the Liberal Party and concern about the North American Free Trade Agreement is John Turner's credibility. So if we want to reverse that, we have to bomb the bridge of John Turner's credibility. And what we did is we ran negative advertising that said, this guy is saying this not because he believes it. He's saying it because he's a crass politician and he wants to scare the shit out of you and get elected. That's the full extent of his emotion. That's the full extent of his motivation. Don't get suckered in. And people said, well, okay, that's probably true. And everything started to reverse.
Yeah, it worked.
Yeah, it did.
Would you do that same campaign today?
No, because I think now, I've got grandchildren, and I someone said, when you look into the abyss looks back. And, I actually care more. I said one time, kind of, again, very crass, I said, I'm not immoral, but I'm amoral. My job is I'm a professional researcher, and my job is to bring objective, effective strategy and advice to my clients to let them win. And that's the full extent of my obligation. I don't believe that anymore. I think that if you enter public life, you have a responsibility for the public good.
Yeah, so back then, if we make the biopic about all this, you're the bad guy in the biopic.
Well, certainly in 1993, I became the bad guy because I shouldn't have been involved in that campaign at all. I was going through a really...
93. Okay, so we'll get to 93. So just on our way to 93. So...
in 1988, I was the big hero. Because I brought back.
But I mean, the movie we watch in 2025, I feel like your character would be the soulless, like anything to get elected guy.
A little bit kind of a crass guy, who's out for himself. He's got a big ego.
Right.
He's doing television. He's on the cover of magazines.
But this was the big thing in the 80s. Like, I'm thinking of Wall Street now and all this.
Look at the music scene in the 80s. The hair bands and
like excess and goodness gracious, Reagan times. Okay, so I do want to ask you about the 93 election. didn't go quite as well as the 88 election. And but on our way there, though, what was your role in the 1992 Canadian referendum?
Well, again, a very, very disappointing activity there. That we set up a big committee that was multi-partisan. I mean, everyone who's sitting around. This is the Charlottetown Accord and Meech Lake previous to that.
Right.
And every political leader was for it. All the political parties were for it. The union movement was for it. And I did the polling, the nightly polling. And it was a big agreement that had, I think, 16 sections or something. And if you looked at each of the sections separately, a majority of Canadians agreed with it. They wanted an elected Senate in Alberta. They wanted a distinct society in Quebec. But then again, and I was going through some bad times of myself personally. My dad had died. My wife had been diagnosed with cancer. And my best friend had died all within 18 months. And we did these, and I hadn't been doing focus groups. Normally I would do focus groups kind of once a week at least to get that kind of real feedback loop to the electorate.
Right.
And we did these focus groups, and I remember going around and saying, what do you guys know about this referendum that is happening? And some said, well, I think we're going to get 2 senates, and they didn't know anything about it. And we said, well, how are you going to vote? And they said, I'm voting against, I'm voting against, I'm voting against. And I said, well, why are you voting against? He says, because those bastards want it so bad. And this was the first real indication of, an electorate that rejecting their political leaders by them advancing and putting forward something that the electorate thought was not only just not for them, but unimportant compared to the other things. 1992, you got inflation is raging, unemployment. You remember James Caravel, it's the economy, stupid.
Of course.
And there was the population now was back in the late 70s and in the mid 80s, they saw problems, but they saw these things as aberrations. Now they're saying this may be real. Progress may not be normal. The next house may not be bigger. The next car may not be fatter. The next paycheck may not be fatter. And I'm worried now. And these guys are dancing in the graveyard.
Now, I said we're going to get to 1993. But first we're going to cover some ground we've skipped over because I am dear friends with Rob Pruce. Do you know Rob Pruce? He was the keyboardist with the Spoons.
Okay, for sure.
Okay. Very young when he was with the Spoons because he was a teenage prodigy. Too young to play in the clubs he was performing in, but that's another story for another day. But he has memories of playing a PC rally, and maybe it was 84, 85, and he has no idea what it was for because I had him over here Monday. We did an episode of Toast with Rob Pruce and Bob Ouellette, and I was trying to pick his brain on this because I knew you were coming over. He says he didn't care about politics. He has no idea what he was supporting or what he was involved in. He doesn't remember getting any money, and we're here to find out, do you have any memory of what the Spoons did for the conservative PC party in the mid-'80s?
Well, and I vaguely remember that, and I remember quite distinctly in Quebec City, even earlier than that, Doug and the Slugs from Vancouver,
of course,
playing. But to say, you have to understand,
Doug Bennett.
You have to understand today is that back then the Progressive Conservative Party was truly a progressive conservative party. It wasn't like it is today, and they weren't.
Like the P meant something,
and that's right. And true progressives, center left, did not vilify them. In fact, the single biggest voting bloc for all the 1980s was liberal PC switchers, and most people could be identified as either red Tories, that is, they were economically conservative and socially liberal, or blue liberals, which is exactly the same thing.
Right.
There wasn't much difference between Paul Martin and Brian Mulroney. They are basically the same human beings. So the notion of a hip band like the Spoons or Doug and the Slugs going to a convention wouldn't be as anathema as it would be now, saying, who wanted to associate myself with
right? Because now you need Kid Rock or something, but
no, because
there's different times.
No, very
different parties.
Very different times. So there wasn't that same kind of, these guys are inherently evil, therefore I want nothing to do with them and not to be associated with them.
Do you remember any specifics at all? I know we're going back a long time about, you're like, Mike, a million things going on with music and this and that, but by the way, we're going to get to the music stuff. I can't believe I haven't got to it, and we're like 45 minutes into this chat. But do you have any specifics at all? Just that I'll cut this out and play it for Rob when he's back next month for Toast. But was it possibly like some kind of a fundraiser for Mulroney's campaign or something? Any memory at all? What
it probably was a party convention. which they would hold every year. And it was a party convention. There was a big element of partying.
Sure.
And it was also a different time. Smoking was much more prevalent, and it was fun. And the Spoons were a hip young band, and one of the things that I always tried to push the conservatives for, I used to tell them that, your floor is way higher than the other guys, that your base is much stronger, but your ceiling is way lower. You got hardly any room to grow, and you've got to start getting constituents that are not embracing you right now, and young people were among them.
And I have this sense that the Spoons would do anything if there was a paycheck at the end of the day, and I'm only saying that because I'm thinking of the Thrifty, was it Stitches or Thrifty? Stitches, right?
Yeah.
The Stitches ad. There was Maxell, the cassette tapes, but the Spoons were kind of there. They were like on board with selling out before it was popular for rock bands to sell out. I think Mick Jagger took notes, maybe, but
Neil Young said, I'm not giving them my brand because I don't want their brand.
Ain't singing for Pepsi.
No,
ain't
for
singing
sure.
for Coke.
Relax.
And when I had tickets to see him at Budweiser stage, which he actually ended up canceling, but he had a rule that they couldn't call it that, maybe on you can't call it Budweiser stage because he's not singing for Budweiser either. And the beers that were sold couldn't be the typical Budweiser beers or something. Like he takes that.
And he's been like that right from the very start.
And do you have a relationship with Neil Young?
No, I've never met him.
Never
He's
met
a
him.
cool guy. I took my kids to see him on the Plains of Abraham in the Quebec Music City, and that they didn't know Neil Young from Adam. And his band was all of Willie Nelson's kids.
Oh,
He-
yeah.
He played for about an hour and a half, maybe 9 songs, did not speak one word to the audience. My son, who at the time was 32,
Right.
came over to me after about 3 minutes and leaned over and he says, "This guy plays like a motherfucker." And I said, "It wasn't Kurt Cobain who started grunge, my son. It was this guy."
Godfather of grunge.
And the guitar playing was just absolutely crazy how good it was.
No, I'm a big fan, big fan, absolutely. And I didn't get to. I've seen him before, but I was really looking forward to seeing him this past summer, and he canceled some dates because he needed to recharge his batteries.
Yeah,
Not a young man anymore.
No, that's for sure.
Not a young man. But okay, so that's good. I got my Spoons update. I'm going to give you some gifts for being here. We're going to cover 93, and then I'm going to play a song and have a conversation with you I've wanted to have for a long time, actually. But what am I giving you, Alan? You're a lucky man because I feel like Monty Hall now. Fresh craft beer.
Excellent.
Great Lakes Brewery. They brewed it right here in southern Etobicoke. Delicious. You'll love it. You'll take some home with you. Palma Pasta sent over a lasagna. Their lasagna is, all their food is great, but this lasagna is next level, man. You've never had store-bought lasagna like this. I've got one in the freezer for you.
You're a great Canadian.
Great
can I say?
Canadian. It's taking care of you with the lasagna, taking care of you with the fresh craft beer. Ridley Funeral Home.
Whoa.
They've sent over, well, it's handy for you. It's to, it's handy to have a measuring tape. So Allan Gregg, that's courtesy of Ridley Funeral Home. And the funeral director there, Brad Jones, has a fantastic podcast called Life's Undertaking, which and we'll talk more about podcasting at the end of this convo. I said I'd come back to Jesse Hirsch, and I will. But that's a great podcast to listen to. We record every 2 weeks, and it's called Life's Undertaking from Ridley Funeral Home.
Neat.
Couple of quick more hits here. One here is to give you a piece of advice that if you have a drawer full of old cables, old electronics, maybe you have old laptops from the early 90s you haven't booted up in 20 years, don't throw that in the garbage because the chemicals end up in our landfill. Go to recyclemyelectronics.ca, put in your postal code, and find out where you can drop it off to be properly recycled. So thank you to recyclemyelectronics.ca for your support. And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome the newest Toronto mic'd partner. It's Fusion Corp Developments, Inc., and I'll have more to say about its founder and CEO, Nick Iones, in the next couple of weeks. But for now, I just want to say welcome to the TMU, Fusion Corp Developments, Inc., and Nick Iones, which is a fun name to say. Nick Iones. All right, 1993. And then I'm going to play a song. What happened, man? What happened for the 93 election?
Well, the shortest answer is basically Canadians reached a conclusion they had reached a couple of years earlier, which is conservative government was bad government. They gave that the benefit of the doubt for a little while when Kim Campbell came on the scene. 'Cause Kim Campbell was an exciting politician. She was a single woman, spoke her own mind, so much so that she could not follow the script, and took what was an early lead in the pre-writ period and basically reduced it down to 2 seats. I was blamed for a lot of what was going on. I took on first way more responsibility than I should. I wasn't just being the pollster. I was and developing the strategy. I was doing all the advertising, all the communications, and everything else. And that we got about 21 points behind. And we said, look, we got to go negative here. And the weak link in their chain is Jean Chrétien. A lot of people have doubts about whether he's a world leader and whether he's up for the job and whether they really want a guy like him to represent them. And so we did these streeters that were interspersed with pictures of him. And stop there for 1 second. Assume that I am really venal and I am really stupid. Even if you accept those 2 things, you cannot say, I've sat down and said, you're 21 points behind. I know what we should do. We should make fun of his face. Right. That was not our strategy. The strategy was to draw attention to his lack of leadership skills. The Liberals, to their credit, immediately seized on the contrary argument that we're making fun of his face.
But the ad did, pardon me, I do remember this. At this point, I'm now able to vote, 1993.
Right.
First time I got to vote, by the way, 1993 federal election. But I do remember the ad was ridiculing his facial deformity.
No, it wasn't, because it's out of stock footage. I came home. I quit the campaign that day. When they pulled those ads, I said, you know what? I got way more credit than I deserved when things were going well. Now I'm getting way more shit.
That's how it works.
Than I deserve when things are going crappy.
Right.
You're on your own. I quit. And I went home, and I remember my wife saying to me, did you really do that? Did you produce an ad that made fun of Jean Chrétien's face? And sitting on the counter was a Globe and Mail. And on one side of the fold was their picture of Jean Chrétien. On the other side of the fold was the picture we used in the advertisement. And I said, look at these pictures. They're exactly the same. That's the way he looks. We're not making fun of his face.
So there was no... It was a picture of him. There was no text on the screen or words from a voiceover person.
Yeah, there was behind it was what we called streeters, which is where you took people on the street,
right,
and you edited their comments to reinforce your message. And it had people saying, I just don't think he's a world leader. I would be embarrassed if he was representing us at the United Nations,
But you obviously approved this ad.
Yes. And tested them in focus groups with no one saying, why are you making fun of that guy's face? Not a person.
Well, you should have called me. I would have given you some good advice, Alan. Because seeing the photo, and you're right, that's how he looks.
But Mike, I say that is the genius of the Liberal response. Post hoc, you could absolutely make the case that we were making fun of his face because his face was what it was.
I felt it at the time.
But no, even as much as I was a mercenary, I would never, ever do that. In fact, I knew Jean Chrétien and liked Jean Chrétien. As we knew all the leaders. I mean, there wasn't that kind of terrible, you're my enemy ethos that you see now. I mean, my best friends on Parliament Hill when I was working there were journalists, members of the New Democratic Party. My partners were both Liberals who had worked for Don Jameson and Minister of Northern Affairs, and I golfed with them for 20 years after the fact, and it was a different environment.
And it was kind of nice. I felt it was maybe you said off the top. I actually wrote it down. Okay, nostalgic old fart, but it felt good to have Chrétien kind of having a moment in the last couple of weeks, speaking up for this country, and that he sounds so sharp. 91 years old.
91 years old. Wrote a great op-ed in the Globe saying, this is nonsense and don't be strong.
And he came on Vassey's show on CTV. I saw some footage of him kind of revisiting these points, and sounded good. I said to Charlie, I said, throw that hat in the ring, Jean. It's have one more run, one more kick at the can.
Well, and while I say in the 1993 election, the electorates had significant doubts. He was the leader of the opposition at this point. But once he became the prime minister, he became quite popular because that little guy from Shawinigan, again, resonated with an electorate that was increasingly becoming, dubious about the greatness of political leaders because he was just a normal guy.
Absolutely. And John Chrétien wins a big majority, and he'd do that again. But so that day you quit the campaign when they pulled that ad.
Not just the campaign. I quit partisan politics.
Okay, that was it for you, 1993.
Yeah, I volunteered to help two friends in their elections. Gordon Campbell out in BC, he was a contemporary, and John Tory in the city of Toronto, who was, again, a great friend and just a tremendous human being. I shouldn't speak in the past tense.
No, he's still hanging around. I still see him
Yeah.
there. I kind of thought he might. I thought maybe he'd disappear or whatever, but he's still going to things. And since John Tory's name came up, a couple of things here. One is, do you think he runs to be a progressive conservative MP in the upcoming provincial election?
I don't know. If you
have any insight into this? You talked to him lately?
If you asked me earlier, of all the people you've met throughout your career, where would you put John Tory in terms of the likelihood of having an affair with someone who was 35 years his junior and hiding it from the others? And I'd say right at the bottom of the list. Every person I know is more likely than John Tory. He was so out of character.
By the book, Tory, yeah.
Yeah, no, he was, because I never worked with anyone who worked harder, who was more ethical, who was driven more by public service. I mean, this guy grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth. 3 generations of Tories. And, he went to public school. And then he went to the Toronto school, where you get in by merit, not. And, he made a mistake. And I know that he's horribly humiliated by the mistake that he's made, and probably believes that he'll never be forgiven.
Do you think, though, he's done with public life?
I hope not. Because I've worked with few people who contribute more to public life than John Tory.
Because there's chatter that he's going to run in this upcoming progressive conservative provincial election.
Hard to imagine him being subservient to Doug Ford, but we'll see.
We'll see. Okay, and you're right. There was no stranger words I heard than John Tory's sex scandal. And Ed Keenan comes on the show every quarter. So we cover lots of stuff, this kind of stuff, every single quarter. We go about 2 hours every 3 months. Ed Keenan in the basement here. And as the details come out, it sounds like it was a mistake. And I'm impressed that he resigned, because I do know that there are political leaders now with such a scandal that would just keep going like that.
Two words: Bill Clinton.
Yeah. No,
no, you're right. In fact, with hindsight, given the cynicism that people have and the lack of trust and the lack of faith that they have in politicians, he could have just toughed it out.
Well, remember who was his predecessor as mayor? It was Rob Ford. And Rob, where do I begin, right? But geez. Okay. But as you dig into the detail, it sounds okay. So he is separated from his wife, although it's not public. And his wife is living a life in Florida, I believe, while John Tory's here.
Right.
So there's that. And the pandemic fucked a lot of us up and changed a lot of things. So this error in judgment, which was a mistake, and I'm glad he chose to resign. That shows some honor there. But you can understand how it happened.
Yes.
In that particular brew, if you will.
Yeah.
Do you think John Tory would ever come on Toronto Mike for a chat?
Interesting question. Further to our earlier parts of the conversation, he'd be well advised to. Very well advised to.
Well, would you advise him to? Do you ever have any conversations with him these days?
He's embarrassed to talk to me.
Oh, yeah. He's feeling some shame and how it all ended for him. Okay. But if you do talk to him, those are your first words, okay?
Exactly.
Get in Toronto Mike's basement, John. Let's just have a chat about it. I don't have any, I don't have this feeling of, even, I talk to people of different political stripes. I don't have this, you're inhuman garbage that you, as somebody who reported to you, a city hall staffer, that you would have an inappropriate relationship with her. I feel disgust for you. I don't have this wiring. I want to have a conversation with this human being who made a mistake, and I want to talk to him.
And I think most people are prepared. If someone, what is it? Bernie Taupin said, sorry seems to be the hardest word. There's nothing that you can do, to gather more ground when you've made a mistake than just to apologize and to show some contrition.
We're all human beings in this world, right? So
sure.
We all make mistakes. Okay. Here's a jam for you right here.
crowd. I'm on the lazy American exit to the Northland. I'm on the lazy American exit to my homeland. I'm on the lazy American exit to my last dance. They keep calling out my name. I shout it down.
With all this rhetoric about Trump annexing this wonderful nation of ours, Canada, I feel like Last American Exit is an appropriate song. And this brings us back to the Tragically Hip EP. And this brings us to the story of Allan Gregg and FOTM Jake Gold and the Tragically Hip. We all watched the Prime documentary recently. Did you watch it, Alan?
Yes.
What did you think of the Prime documentary series on the Tragically Hip?
We're so proud of Mike Downey, Gord's brother. I mean, he's a legitimate filmmaker. I mean, I actually got him his first job at the CBC. But it was very hard for him because, I mean, part of the story is, you know, is tragic, pardon the pun, and emotional and sad, but also it's very candid. And he shows that, you know, Gord made a lot of mistakes, and mistakes that not only hurt the band's career, but hurt his friends in the band. And it wasn't easy for Mike to have that kind of level of honesty. And anyway, I was just very, very proud of them, and I just thought it was a really good piece of film as well. Anyone who likes documentary film would enjoy this, whether they know anything about the Tragically Hip or not.
Agreed on all counts. And I say that as a fan of the band since I heard Blow It High Dough on Q107 back in '89, I guess it was. Okay, so part of that documentary series, we see footage from Venture, I believe, a CBC show. So
Jake and I both at 2:20 smoking cigarettes.
Yeah. So you're in, and we can see, you know, we see Jake with the look he had at the time, and it's like, oh, I didn't, because, you know, some of us don't really see a lot of Jake until Canadian Idol.
Right.
And then we're like, we see you, and we see you guys, and you're kind of, you got this band from Kingston, Ontario, and this EP exists in the world, but you're trying to get a distribution like a record deal, and maybe let's hear from you, less from me. People can watch the documentary, but how did you meet Jake Gold, and what is the story there with the Tragically Hip and your? Because I'm trying to understand how this coexists concurrently with your conservative strategist pollster career. Like, it seems like we got you to 93 before you quit, right? But we're in the late 80s here.
Yeah.
So let's hear from you. I need the real story here, Allan.
Well, I always loved music. I mean, you know, I grew up, as I say, in the prairies in the 50s and 60s. At that time, other kids, for their birthday, they wanted a Davy Crockett hat. I wanted a Fats Domino record. And I had a really hip dad. My father was a very cool guy, loved music, was a zoot-zooter, brought music from Big Pink for me. He said, you might like this. When I was in grade 12, he knew more about what was happening in the music scene then. Anyway, so music was always part of my life. I got a guitar when I was 6 years old. Took me maybe 10 years to learn how to tune it. I became clear that my ambition was far greater than my talent. So I started managing bands, and while I was in high school, and then got very, very serious about academe and didn't really put that behind me, except there was a guy who I went to high school with who continued to want to become a recording star, and I tried to help him. I executive produced a record with Randy Bachman with him, and we put it out.
That's FOTM Randy Bachman. I just want to tell you.
There you go. We put it out on the West Coast. Nothing happened, and a lot of people who were in the business said, you got to bring him to Toronto and do a showcase and get him signed by a real label. You can't put it out on your own little bullshit label. And so I said, well, you know, I love music, and I think I know a lot about what is good music and bad music, but I have no idea how to put on a showcase show. And so I was talking to another high school friend, a guy called Earl Seymour, who's a saxophonist for Blood, Sweat, and Tears at the time. And he said, I got a young guy. His name's Jake Gold, really good in lights and production. He's very capable, and I'll get you in touch with him, and he can help you put on this showcase. So we put on the showcase at the Diamond Club, Phoenix.
Now the Phoenix, yeah.
And it was brilliant in terms of the production, the lights, the sound. We had everyone in the music industry out there, and nothing happened. No one wanted to sign this band. And afterwards, I went to Jake and said, look, I really appreciate what you did. It was great. I said, how much do I owe you? And he said, nothing. I said, well, what do you mean nothing? You worked your ass off for the last 2 months. He says, no, he says, I did it just to get an opportunity to work with you. At this point in time, I was pollster to the Prime Minister. I mean, I had a big profile. I'd been in the cover of magazines, Toronto Life and what have you. So he knew who I was. I wasn't just some kind of grifter who had money to give him to do this. So I said, well, come to my house and we'll talk. And he was in a relationship, a management relationship with another guy who he didn't like. And he was clearly junior. I said, look, leave him. I'll give you enough money to have an office and a salary for a year. You do all the operations, all the upfront stuff, and I'll help you with strategy and all the creative stuff. And it was originally, the company was called Jacob J. Gold and Associates. I was just the associate because I had my business, Decima Research, and all these other sorts of things. And he had an artist already that he had signed, New Regime, to what was RCA Records, what became BMG Records. But the very first band we signed was this band from Kingston called the Tragically Hip, who at that point in time had not written an original song. They were a cover band playing the Manor, did a lot of good Doors stuff. We brought them up. I got a tape from a friend, believe it or not, and was playing it for another guy who was a radio consultant. And he says, there's something there. And so I called up Jake and said, let's get these guys up to do a show for us. They came up, played in a place called Larry's Hideaway.
Of course, I just moderated a panel for Gary Topp's new book.
Oh, really?
So a lot of Larry's Hideaway chatter there.
That right across the street, The Edge, for sure. And they opened for a Rolling Stone cover band, and it was just incendiary. I mean, not only was Gord Downie mesmerizing, but the band was so good. You know, it's the Malcolm Gladwell thing. You know, you got to put your 10,000 hours in. And these guys had. I mean, they had been, as the documentary showed, they've been playing since they were 14, 15 years old. And we signed them that night. We took them to the Tavern Restaurant, and we signed them to a management deal. And then later on, I sat them down and said, look, we can do one of two things. We can just be your managers, in which instance we'll take 20% of everything you make. Or you can sign a deal with us, and we will be management, publishing company, and record company, in which instance we'll invest in you. And they said, well, let's do the latter. And so we signed a deal. And this which you just playing, Last American Exit, was one of 6 songs off a little EP. They couldn't get the band signed. We would have them come every Friday, the last Friday of the month, to the Hotel Isabella. And the crowds were lining up outside the street on the block after about 3 or 4 months. And we would bring guys like Steve Anthony and Gary Slade and others to see the band. And they all said they're really good, but, you know, they're a bar band. They were kind of like a Rolling Stone clone band. They hadn't written Boots or Hearts or, you know.
But even that song I just played, which they wrote.
Yes.
Like, maybe it's my bias because I did buy Up to Here like the day after I heard Blow It High Dough, and I loved every freaking song on Up to Here, and then Forevermore, big Hip fan, obviously. Perfect age, you know. But that to me sounds like a great fucking song.
It is, and it holds up. It still is. But we couldn't get the band signed. Literally, we made that record because the band had never been in a recording studio. And a good friend of mine, Sid Kessler, owned recording studios at this time. He basically says, I'll give you a week's worth of work for only $5,000. And we got Ken Greer, who was the lead guitar player for Tom Cochran's band at the time, Red Rider, who wanted to be a producer, to work with them. And when we went in there, we said, look, this is you learning how to record music. If it's no good, we're going to throw it in the garbage can, and it'll be a good experience for you. If it's good, we'll talk about what we're doing then. So they finished it. We went, this is very, very good. And so we went to RCA Records, where Jake had his relationship with, and we played it for the guy who's the A&R guy. And he says, I like it. I'd like to do a deal. I'd like to license it for you. How much advance would you like? And we said, nothing. He said, well, what do you mean nothing? So we need an advance. We've paid for it already. But what we want is we want to guarantee that you will spend $25,000 marketing it. And guess what else? You will not give this record to pop radio. You will only give it to album-oriented rock radio. And so, well, what if the pop stations want it? I said, they won't want it. And if they do ask for it, then we're in the driver's seat, aren't we? And tell the album-oriented rock stations, there were only 19 at the time, only they are getting this. They would be the only radio stations who would understand. And lo and behold, Small Town Bring Down got some radio play. And we got friends of ours again to do a video at the Manor. And it was, again, quite opportunistic. It was Frosh Week at Queen's. So the place was jammed and everyone was drunk out of their head. So it looked like they were a massive band already,
Right.
even though they kind of weren't. And we only sold 10,000 of those records. And the new guy who took over as the head of A&R at what was then BMG Records wouldn't sign them. He said, I don't get them. I think they really should be an alt-country band like Blue Rodeo. I said,
Right.
are you kidding me? Are you nuts? And so we took another 2 years to get them signed to MCA Records, in which we toured them all over the place and bought promo from American radio stations, took them to college music journal festivals, and they worked and worked and worked and worked and worked. And finally, a guy called Bruce Dickinson at MCA Records in New York signed them.
What a story, you know? And I mean, I'm thinking of that EP now, which again, I bought Up to Here first, and then I had to go back. I did this with Nirvana too. I bought Nevermind first, and then I picked up Bleach, and I'm like, where was I? Like, how did I miss all this?
Well, the EP only sold 10,000 then. It's sold over 1 million copies since. So.
Yeah, that's I guess that's typical, right? It happened to Green Day. I
Yeah.
know it happens to a lot of bands.
Yes.
It's like, oh, I bought Dookie, and then I realized, oh, there's something before that. But okay, there should be. I mean, take a note, Rob and Bob. We got to do a toast about the releases you didn't discover till after the breakthrough, if you will. But like, Highway Girls on this thing, Evelyn, like it's pretty good EP actually. But so MCA gave you a deal. Is that a U.S. deal?
Yes, it was a U.S. deal, and again, it was, and they were really behind the band, and we went to Ardent Studios in Memphis. Don Smith, who had been Tom Petty's engineer, and he'd graduated to what was the band that Tom Petty had with
Heartbreakers? No,
no, we had the Heartbreakers, but this was Bob Dylan.
Of course. Take Handle with Care. It's funny how
Roy Orbison. Come on.
Traveling Wilburys.
Traveling Wilburys.
Yeah, Traveling Wilburys.
And we just finished their record, and really good guy. You know, he didn't want to put his hands too far on the scale. Knew the band, and they had been, as I say, working forever about this, but wrote songs like I hadn't heard 38 years old, Never Kissed a Girl. And just like, it was like, what? Because we had them kind of pigeonholed as a kind of a rock band too. And I remember Gord Sinclair saying, you know, we're not the Cult. We're way more diverse than that. And they heard the record, the Up to Here. The MCA United States really liked it. We knew that New Orleans is Sinking was the hit, but we were so confident that it would do well, we wanted to warm them up with Blow at High Dough. Blow at High Dough went top 10 album-oriented rock radio in the States, very well on college radio. Put out New Orleans is Sinking, went top 10 album-oriented rock radio, but we didn't sell any records.
Why not?
Because again, I remember I had actually had a relationship at this point in time with Viacom. We went to MTV. We had made the videos. First, they'd made a mistake. I mean, I made the Small Town Bring Down and Last American Exit videos for them. By this time, they're recording artists. They're saying, we want to make our own video. And so the video for Blow at High Dough is just vomit. I mean, it's just a whole bunch of, you know, incomprehensible images and it came literally out of their mouths what they wanted. So MTV, we went to see the John Sears, who was running MTV at the time, and he says, they're just not an MTV band. And I said, well, what do you mean they're not an MTV band? If we gave you the best video that you ever had in your life, you say you wouldn't play it? He says, no, I wouldn't. They're just not an MTV band. And again, this is when MTV was so important.
But does this have anything to do with the fact that they're Canadian?
That they're Canadian, that they're, I mean, I wrote a memo earlier on saying that the Tragically Hip are the boys next door, that's your positioning. But
it's only because this big hit we're talking about is literally called New Orleans is Sinking. Like, that sounds as American as anything. And I mean, there's a song on that album which has, you know, you mentioned Blue Rodeo earlier, but Boots or Hearts is kind of a country song.
It is.
And it's to me, it sounds, that could be an American band. And we got this eccentric, this charismatic lead singer who is Michael Stipe-esque.
Well, see, they're getting album-oriented rock radio. No video at all.
I'm mad all these decades later, Alan.
MCA would not make a video of New Orleans is Sinking. We had to make it. Got a guy from Calgary to make it and put it, because they were finished with the record. because it just was not selling, and MTV was not going to do anything for it. So again, we had to put up the money for that. Then, album number 2 comes, Road Apples, and we're hearing, these infamous words, no career-breaking hit single. Wow. And it was dead on arrival. They would not, MCA States would not make out any videos. Again, we
not even Little Bones.
No, we made that ourselves. And by this time, we were just saying, these guys have given up on us. And MCA at that time, they had Tom Petty in their roster, but no other rock bands. It was all Bobby Brown and all kinds of...
they were more R&B.
Yes.
Yeah. Maybe country too, I feel.
Yes, very strong country.
Yeah.
They had great...
but not rock.
Not out of rock at all. And we knew they'd just given up on the band. They'd sent their entire crew in advance of Road Apples coming out to Vancouver to see the band play in a hockey arena. I can't remember where it was. It wasn't the Coliseum, but it was a big venue. And they chartered a plane and really excited. And then this no career-breaking hit singles. And this where a lot of the Canadian stuff did come out. Because they say stuff like, 50 Mission Cap. What is that about? Who is Bill Barilko?
Yeah, but that's Fully Completely, right?
This is no. I think 50 Mission Cap is on this, isn't it?
I don't think so.
Isn't it? I thought.
I don't think so. I have it here. I should just read it.
Take a look.
My brain. What do I know? I just remember it being on Fully Completely. But you're 100% right, because there were a lot of what I call Cordelia, Fiddler's Green.
Yeah,
these are beautiful songs.
Yeah, Fiddler's Green again. They did not understand at all. They just thought, I thought this was a rock band. Anyway, so
Long Time Running is on this.
Long Time. When I took this to Chicago and did focus groups, and Long Time Running was a hit. There's no question. But again, I could not get that.
It's my wedding song,
Really?
Yeah.
It literally, I did these focus groups. Kanye came with me, and we did them, and they had overwhelming response. Wrote a memo to MCA. They didn't care. So we
didn't get it. It's better for us if you don't understand, but maybe not better for you and Jake.
That's right. So it was interesting. I think the thing that a lot of people don't understand, and it isn't fully documented in the documentary, is there were a lot of times where their career was stalled very badly.
Right.
Sometimes by their own doing. Again, I'll never forget. I think it was just before, just as Up to Here came out. I got a call from them. They were in Portland, Oregon, and Gord Sinclair is on the phone. He says, we've had a band meeting and that we're not going to play at the record store. And I said, well, why aren't you going to play at the record store? He said, well, we don't think it's kind of consistent with who we are and who we want to be. And I said, well, let me tell you something here. The promo guy in the business thinks you should do it. The guy who works retail thinks you should do it. They're going to think you're assholes if you don't do it.
Right.
And he said, well, let me put Gord on. So he puts Downey on. Downey could always get me. And he says, if that's the price of not being successful, then we're prepared to pay it. We're not doing this gig. And I said, it's your career, not mine. But you're making a huge mistake.
That story jives, the story in the documentary.
Sam the Record
Sam
Man
the Record
versus
Man
Towers.
story.
This was way before that.
Yeah.
Way before that.
And it's of course, it makes me just like the band more, right? That they had this code, this integrity, this ethical,
the Towers Record, Sam the Record Man thing, they were a big band by then. They could afford to walk with it. These guys had nothing.
Right.
They were on their first tour of the United States. They were playing tiny venues. You know who opened for them in Long Beach? Is Nirvana.
Wow.
But they
wow.
I remember going to a gig again on the West Coast because we were so stupid that we insisted that they be the last band up, which is the headliner, of course.
Right.
Well, they got on the stage at 1 o'clock and there was no one left.
Right. Well, this is like Triumph at the big festival or whatever
exactly.
it is.
Anyway, so
Allan, again, we're gonna have to do a sequel because I still have more hip stuff. I knew I could do easily 90 minutes on the Tragically Hip, but I have 1,600 episodes in the archive, so I've talked to many a Canadian success story that talks about the moment they not gave up on the States, but realized they're better to focus here. I'm thinking now of Kim Mitchell, okay? Because Kim Mitchell had post Max Webster, he had a U.S. record label, and his big song was "Go for Soda."
Right.
And they were pushing it on U.S. radio, but he tells me a story how they also had on the same label Twisted Sister.
Right.
And the label decided to favor We're Not Going to Take It by Twisted Sister over Go for Soda by Kim Mitchell, and basically gave up on Kim Mitchell, and he was kind of left to die on the vine, and he came back home and realized, I love playing to Canadians here in Canada, and they seem to love me.
And Twisted Sister would be easier to understand. You know, Kim Mitchell was pretty, he was a little bald, a terrific guitar player, and different. He just didn't fit the mold.
No.
But no, listen, first off, it's the risk of stating the obvious. I mean, America is, 10 times the size of Canada.
Yeah.
You got to work 10 times as hard. You know, a band like Bare Naked Ladies had what they called a concentric circle strategy. Where they said, okay, we're going to break Chicago. And they worked Chicago like a Chicago band. And then once they established an audience there, they said, okay, we're going to have a concentric circle now 100 miles from Chicago. And it went on and on and on. One of the things that happened to the Tragically Hip is that first time we sent them across the country on the little record, all the club owners, all the radio guys said, Jesus, these guys are nice. We just loved having them here. They're decent human beings. They're polite. They're funny. They're everything that we'd ever want in terms of a band coming to our venue. And by the time Road Apples is here, now they're playing big venues. And they've got a guitar tech, and they've got a drum tech, and they've got a sound man, and they've got a light man, and they've got everything. And they go to the club in Toledo that has 250 people. And they got a guitar tech, a drum tech, a sound man, a light man. And the guys who are owning the club in Toledo are going, who are these fucking pussies? Who do they think they are, little dipshits? And that kind of, and it was hard to go from playing, Massey Hall to a little club in Toledo where the people who owned it thought you were pretentious because you had all of this gear and all this equipment and all this, all this other stuff. So it was hard for them. That all said, they go out of their way, but it's true, is that they could go to Austin, Texas, they could go to Boston, they could go to LA, and they would play the top clubs in all those markets throughout their career.
It's interesting you brought up Bare Naked Ladies. I also quite like Bare Naked Ladies, who get their start really just kind of camping out in the hallways of CFNY in Brampton.
Yeah.
Right? So, but one of the big moments for them that helped them crack the U.S. market, where they'd eventually get a #1 Billboard Hot 100 hit, is a friendship with Jason Priestley. So, they leverage their friendship because Jason was a fan, being a BC guy.
Yeah.
And he gets them, basically, they play the Peach Pit, okay? They get on Beverly Hills 90210. And then this really does help with some success, like the Old Apartment and stuff. They have some top 40 success, but it really spins out of this exposure on Beverly Hills 90210. I just wonder now, the equivalent, I suppose, would be Dan Aykroyd from Kingston, Ontario, being a huge advocate and fan of this band, this great fucking band, by the way, whether they're from Mars or they're from Kingston, they're a great fucking band. And he gets them, Lorne Michaels agrees that they can be the musical performer on Saturday Night Live. So are you still, when do you stop managing the Tragically Hip?
Well, it was, my wife had died literally the week before. They played on Saturday Night Live. And they called me from Texas saying, we'll shut this tour down. I said, no, my wife wouldn't want you to shut the tour down. You keep playing. My son went with them to New York for Saturday Night Live. But I kind of took a step back when she got sick, and we had a big problem with Day for Night, that they brought the record to me, and I just said, this isn't finished. You're going back into the studio. And they said, well, it's finished. And I said, no, it isn't. I said, you got 2 solid tracks here, and the rest is shit, absolute shit. And again, they put Gordon.
Scared is pretty good too, though.
That's about me. That is about me, word for word. You make me scared. Nice doing business with you.
Right.
It's a focus group.
Right.
It's about Allan.
That's about Allan Gregg.
That's about Allan Gregg.
My brains are on the walls here.
No, it is a biography.
Probably my favorite song on that album, actually.
And no, they wrote it because they were. Again, you have to understand. I mean, because I had a career, and I was very successful at my career, and loved them, and loved what I was doing for them. But what I could do for them was something they believed they should be doing for themselves. Jake is different. They didn't want to organize a tour. They didn't want to do a settlement at the end of the day for them. But I was doing all the strategy. I was doing all the creative stuff. I was and saying, this is going to be the single. This is going to be the single. And at that point, you know, they'd had success. They had 3 records, and Fully Completely was brilliant. I mean, it really is one of the greatest.
And that's where 50 Mission Cap is.
It is. Okay, you're better than me, Mike. What can I say?
Well, I was listening to it on CFNY and Q107.
And so they put Gord on the line again. And he says, this record's finished. And I said, well, your name is on that, not mine. You're going to have to live with it. This will be the absolute apex of your career. It will not go well from here because this was not sustainable from this record. And he said, Allan, he said, given the choice between you being my manager and being my friend, I'd prefer you are my friend. And he said it with love. And he, until the day he died, he and I were great friends and real soulmates. Wow. But it was, the threat was obvious. I couldn't be both. If I wanted to stay to be his manager, I wasn't going to be his friend anymore. Because
but how do they separate you and Jake? Aren't you the management trust? Or like, aren't you?
Yeah, but Jake, it is very interesting. Jake is just a very interesting guy. I mean, when he started, when he helped me with that showcase, he was very much the junior partner. I mean, he had no say in anything because I was Allan Gregg and he was nobody.
Right.
And when he got inducted into the Hall of Fame this summer, I said it on the video. I said he just got smarter and smarter and more confident and more confident. I don't know how the hell it happened, but and you know, Isaiah Berlin talks about, you know, the fox and the hedgehog. You know, a hedgehog's really good at one thing, and that's what artist managers normally are.
Right.
Foxes are really good at strategy, and Jake was a hedgehog who all of a sudden developed the mind of a fox, and. At this point in time, I say I was going through just terrible, terrible times, 1993, 94, 95. And I was happy to stay back. I say my wife died right before they went on Saturday Night Live. I went 8 years. I didn't work full time, looking after my kids. So I stayed friends with the band all the way through. Went to all their weddings, went to their kids' christenings, still write them to this day. Trying to get them back on stage, trying to get them to play live and understand they could be a jam band.
Will they? I mean, we had the one performance at the Junos with Leslie Feist,
right?
And I actually had Paul Langlois here in the basement. Jake brought him over a couple of summers ago, and I said maybe Danny Graves. Like I was just trying to think, no one can replace Gord. You're not replacing. Gord.
No.
It's gonna be the Tragically Hip with like Gasly Center. But I was thinking. Danny Graves, at least there's that in, you know, the Watchmen relationship and everything, and Danny being a fantastic singer. But will the Tragically Hip ever perform again?
I would love that they would, if they could get their heads around that they're not the Tragically Hip, they're the Hip. Because they're not going to replace Gord Downie. You're right. I mean, Gord Downie, but and it's not just Danny Graves. I mean, they could do, think about this, you know, Sarah Harmer could come and do some real slow stuff. Yeah. Dallas Green could do the mid-tempo stuff. Yeah. Then they get Ian Thornley. To do Blow It High Do and rip it with Robbie Baker on guitar would be massive. And I've told them I wrote both, and Robbie's the problem. He just does not want to do any of this, and I think he's troubled anyway. But I wrote Gord Sinclair and him saying, you know, why don't you guys get together at the Bathhouse and play Freebird, and just see how that feels, and because they're a jam band, you know, well,
the band you talked about, the Doors. I always thought of them.
Yeah,
Van Morrison and them.
Yeah. And they're underappreciated as and I said it didn't make it to the final cut on the documentary, but I said, look, they are one of the greatest rhythmical bands in the world. Right. Maybe not quite as good as Booker T and the MGs, Little Feat, or the Dave Matthews Band, but I think probably ahead of the Rolling Stones. The ability to bring it up and bring it down. You know, all those riffs that Jake would go through,
right?
That they made those very special by virtue. It's all ad lib. They didn't rehearse any of that.
Okay, so what I've done now is I made the mistake of checking the clock here. So here I'm gonna see if I can get a commitment from you live on the recording because I'm not editing a stitch. But could we do a sequel? Like I want to cover a few more spots here, but could I get you back down here? Like how was this for you?
It was great. It was a great time, and I really enjoyed the conversation.
That's not a commitment though. Like. Would you come back for a second round?
My problem is I live in Mexico most of the time.
Oh, yeah, that is a problem.
Yeah.
Okay. What brings you to Toronto today? Besides this Toronto Mike appearance.
My daughter had her third son, so I
congrats.
came up to be an indulgent grandpa.
Okay, that's amazing. But at some point, with you might be back in Toronto. What if,
Sure.
So, okay, there's the commitment I'm looking for here. That's legally binding, by the way, just so you know here.
Done.
So, because I'm going to cover some quick hits here, because I do have a client who's going to be here for a 2 o'clock recording, so I don't have unlimited time. And
we're good.
Like I said,
I'll
lots
come
of meat
back.
on the bones
Promise.
here. You'll come back here. Okay, so one quick note is on the live stream, VP of Sales says, your voice sounds very similar to Rob Baker's. So you and Rob Baker would have similar vocal conversations.
I should put him on my lap and be a ventriloquist and have him say things I want him to say rather than the things that he says.
And Rob, it sounds like Rob is the holdout on this Tragically Hip.
He's always been, he's a little bit older than the other guys, and his documentary shows was far more established than the other guys as kind of a.
Well, his dad was a judge.
Oh, but all of their parents. Yeah. Johnny's dad was a heart surgeon, and Gord Sinclair's dad was the dean of medicine at. Paul Langlois' dad was the phys ed coach at the Kingston High School, and Gord Downey's dad was the most successful real estate guy. They came from very good families. And I don't mean that just in terms of having money, but just really supportive, good family upbringing.
And all but Gord decided to stay there.
Yeah. Johnny's here now. But yeah, and that was a problem as well. So.
Well, again, we got a sequel for all my missed stuff here, but could you real quick hits here?
Sure.
The Song Corp.
Yes.
Tell us who was involved, what it was, and basically why it didn't.
It was a mistake.
See, I knew it'd be a quick hit.
I had my wife died in 1995. A friend of mine got me this gig as the president of Viacom Canada.
Right.
And Viacom, huge organization, with Paramount Studios, Paramount Pictures, MTV, later on NBC. And they bought some Canadian assets, and they had to set up a Canadian corporation. And it was basically just a smokescreen to look like they cared about Canada. And so I kind of did that on a part-time job, and it was going to end in the 2000. 2000, the stock market was crazy, before the dot-com bubble.
Right.
And I said I was missing music. And so I said, well, why don't I put those two things together? So I went out in the markets and raised $33 million, bought the largest independent record company in Canada, Attic Records, the largest independent publishing company, the music publishing company, hired a guy who ran all distribution operations for Polygram Records and put it all together and took it public as the Song Corp. And then the dot-com bubble broke. Then Napster came on the scene. Then it became very clear that the multinational did not want a big independent. They started stealing our distribution deals, and the company was bankrupt in 18 months.
Yeah, before he passed, obviously, I say that sentence as if I could have him on after he passed away, but Al Mayer was an FOTM as well.
Yes.
We had a good and Molly Johnson, too.
Yeah, we signed her, and she gave me such shit. When
you and I are in the same club, then. I got shit for you can listen to the Molly Johnson episode.
She just said you should be ashamed of yourself, Alan. You've always been a good human being, and what you've done is unconscionable.
But we all make mistakes. You had the best intentions, and it ended up being a disaster.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a classic case of hubris. It says just because you're good in one thing, buddy, doesn't mean you're good at everything. And there's a good lesson there.
Few more notes that came in. One is Jake Gold did hear you were coming on Toronto Mike. Hello to Jake, FOTM Jake. Jake, let's get some more members of the Tragically Hip in the basement, shall we? Paul Langlois was amazing.
Yeah, they're exhausted.
And he played live. They're exhausted. We'll give him a little breather here, and then they can when they're ready. But he just wrote, I might have a question for Alan, and then put a happy face emoji. So no further questions came, but Jake will be listening. So hello to Jake. How is your relationship today with Jake Gold?
See him. Kind of talk to him every week and see him every time I can.
Beautiful. Okay. Arlene Bishop, who was just here making her Toronto Mike debut, wrote, "Hey, Mike, Arlene Bishop here, sending some love and appreciation over to Allan Gregg. Alan was encouraging and supportive back in the early days, and it's always meant the world to me. Thank you for doing that, Alan. You made a positive difference in my life."
Isn't that nice? We got a lot of kudos for the success of Ian Thornley, of The Watchmen, of Andrew Cash, who we managed, and the Tragically Hip. But we also managed some terrific artists like Arlene Bishop, who we were never able to take across the finish line. But she just was such a passionate, genuine, the real deal of her and Blair Packham, who again I just loved because his lyrics were always so great and crazy, and
he's the last of the Red Hot Fools. That Blair Packham.
Yeah.
Yeah, Blair Packham's a good FOTM too. Hello to Blair. Yesterday I was texting with him. I'm like, I really need Eric Schenkman from the Spin Doctors on the show because he's living in Toronto. I'm like, we get this Eric on the show. And Blair did his thing, reached out to Eric. Eric's in the calendar. He's going to visit next week.
Nice.
So, that's the kind of guy Blair Packham is. And yeah, his ex-wife and dear friend, Arlene Bishop, came out. She's been diagnosed as an adult with ADHD and on the autism spectrum.
Really?
And you should really listen to this episode where we talked about the difference it's made in her life.
No, I will.
It was only a couple weeks ago, and please listen to Arlene Bishop on Toronto Mike, an important episode. And again, quick hits here before we got to take a photo in the minus 30-degree tundra out there, which I'm looking forward to. Geez, it's almost like there's a lot here because I want to close with some Jesse Hirsch. But let us please spend a moment and tell me about your relationship with the Toronto International Film Festival.
Well, again, I got involved very, very early days. I mean, they didn't even have a corporate sponsor, not one. And the only way they could get any people to come to their shows was if they paid for a big celebrity to come up, and that they showcased these shows in the Ryerson Theater. I mean, it was nothing like it was today, and that I knew a couple of people who were part of the board, and they said, look, we know what you've done for the Globe and Mail in terms of doing advertising about their readers and having used that to get advertisers to come. Because the Globe and Mail said, as long as we're doing cost per thousand, we lose to the Toronto Star all the time.
Right.
So, but we know we have more golfers than they do.
Yeah, they got higher educated.
We have more Mercedes-Benz owners. Yeah. So I did that research for them so that they said, can you do the same thing for the Toronto Film Festival? Can you interview the people who have come to the Toronto Film Festival, get a profile for them, get the kind of things they consume, so we can start using this for our sponsorship activity? Because they had no sponsors at that time at all. None. Not one corporate sponsor. This was in 1984, I think.
Okay.
85. And I did it for them for free, for nothing. Back then, Decima, we did 10% pro bono work. Every revenue that we had, we give 10 cents back to the not-for-profit sector. And showed it to them. They just said, wow, can you help us use this? And I said, sure, that's what I do. They said, well, wow, can you come on the board?
Yeah.
And I came on the board. And at the time, again, it was all people who were involved in the film industry. They didn't know anything about anything other than how to make films. And it was a crazy time. Tremendous executive director in terms of a guy called Wayne Clarkson, and someone who became a great friend of mine, Helga Steffensen, after that. And after 5 years, they asked me whether I wanted to be the chair of the board. And so I stayed on for another 5 years as the chair.
Wow.
And this was in a period where it went from nothing to something.
Well, sounds to me, and you played a massive role in making the TIFF what it is today. Like you played a big role.
Helga and I certainly oversaw the transition of it to kind of a quaint regional cultural event to a must-attend for Hollywood big stars.
Wow. Okay. Shout out to the late, great Roger Ebert.
Yes.
Loved his TIFF.
Well, and he would, we used to have a thing called the Floating Film Festival where Dusty Cole, who started the film festival, would hire a boat, a cruise, and we'd all go, 150 of us, around the Caribbean. And Roger was always on there, and he would introduce movies for us every night after dinner. And we would watch, and it was always a great event.
I think he's the only movie critic who won a Pulitzer or something.
Yeah,
like
he's
that.
brilliant. He
Yeah,
really was.
And I'll just say, I missed the days of in syndication. It might air at funny times, but tuning in the old over-the-air television and watching Siskel and Ebert. Yeah. I miss those days because I'm also a nostalgic.
They were a little bit crusty for me, but
I like crusty.
Roger in person, he just loved film.
Yeah, he loved film, and he was a great writer. And listeners of this program know I'm a big fan of the crusty. Okay, so did you do all right financially when you sold your shares of Decima?
Not as well as the newspaper said I did, but yes, I became sufficiently wealthy that I didn't have to work anymore.
Okay, and then again, you'll do a sequel when I can ask more questions. But we covered a bit of it off the top, but it doesn't sound like this was the core business venture, but you were hosting the Allan Gregg in Conversation With.
Right.
And that was on our public broadcaster, TV Ontario. And we talked about that off the top. They'd edited it down into the half an hour, but it was an in-depth interview. And why does that ever have to end? Did you decide you were done, or did they cancel it?
I did it for 19 years, and they canceled it. I think to be honest, it was an embarrassment to the agenda because I had put up my own subscriber YouTube, and my subscribers were far exceeding the agendas.
There's some real talk right there.
Well, no, in part, I remember one of the people I interviewed into the show was Sir David Attenborough, kind of the godfather of documentary television. And he said, when I started, everyone said, why would you ever do documentary TV? He says, today, I'm the biggest profit center in the BBC because my work lasts forever and it travels everywhere. And these shows were exactly the same. I mean, Allen Ginsberg isn't giving any more interviews. Right. So if you want to see Allen Ginsberg having a conversation with someone, it's in Allan Gregg in Conversation. And so, whereas what Steve Paikin did today is, who cares?
In 2 weeks, it's yesterday's news.
It's gone.
Right.
So this was accumulating this tremendous
evergreen
track record. And it was just, I say, me and a producer and a researcher. It had been 19 years. They were under tremendous pressure from the provincial government to focus on education. And the only Queen's Park outlet was Paikin's agenda. So I think given the choice, they had to do something.
Okay. Friendly with Steve Paikin? Or frenemies, maybe?
Yeah, because I think what happened is that, he acquiesced to this, saying, well, I can take some of Greg's guests, and we can do the same kind of thing. We can have some long format interviewing. And, little bit kind of opportunistic on his part, I think.
I have noticed a recent trend that somebody will be in the basement and I'll see him on agenda shortly thereafter. It happened with Amber Morley, who was just, so shout out to Paikin, who I know is listening, and he knows I'm a big fan, big Paikin head here. Although the way this interview is going, I'm going to be a big Greg head.
There you go.
We got to call him Greg heads. Okay, we got to coin that. Can you copyright that? Okay. But Charlie Angus appeared on the agenda shortly after his viral moments in this very basement last Monday, and Amber Morley. So shout out to Steve Paikin. Okay, so we only have literal minutes remaining here, and I wanted to talk about Jesse Hirsch because he's the reason you're in this basement right now. So did Jesse say, hey, you should do Toronto? Like, what did Jesse say to you that got you to pay a visit to the South Etobicoke basement?
Well, as I say, I've known Jesse for over 20 years, and for the last couple of months, he and I have been talking every week. And he's got a Substack a series, and they say he's a cultural techno anthropologist. He looks at stuff. He did a piece, yesterday that says social media isn't social because there's no decentralization, there's no democracy, there's no control of the people who are actually, the platform is supposed to serve. It's served by Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and these people. And I find that his conversations with him very stimulating. And so he said, you really should start the Substack too. And so he's been helping me with that. That's almost autobiographical, but it's, we're calling it vanity and learning. Which two words you don't see together. But the attempt is to not only tell my story, but also to demonstrate what has been learned and what is applicable to today. And we've talked about the prospect of just taking our conversations perhaps to our own podcast. So we're, in the discussion stage.
Okay, so am I hearing this? There might be a podcast with you and Jesse?
Possibly, yeah.
Okay, this is breaking news here. I should play a sound effect or something. If I were a morning zoo show, I'd have something lined up.
Well, as
here.
I say, we have so much fun having our weekly conversations anyway. We just thought, maybe someone would like to eavesdrop on this.
Well, I mean, I'd be one of those people who would like to eavesdrop on that. And I will report that Jesse Hirsch will make his second visit to the basement at some point soon. I don't have the date in front of me, but looking forward to it. But you, Allan Gregg, are going to come back. But is there anything like on your drive here on this cold Wednesday morning that you're like, oh, I hope I get a chance to say this, or this is the moment where you can throw it out there now? Anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to speak to?
No, Mike, you've covered a lot of ground here.
We did cover a lot of ground, I think.
Really enjoyed the conversation.
And thank you, because I literally had 2 hours more Tragically Hip questions.
We'll come back. I promise. We'll come back.
Come back. Okay, Alan, this was amazing. And Jesse, you were right. He writes me this. First of all, he had me at hello. He wrote me this note like, would you consider talking to Allan Gregg? And I'm like, of course. Like, you listen to Toronto Mike. Allan Gregg is precisely the kind of guy I want to talk to. So thank you so much for carving out well over 90 minutes as I look at my watch. I really do appreciate that. Not everybody will do that.
The pleasure was mine.
And that brings us to the end of our 1,618th show. Go to torontomike.com for all your Toronto Mike needs, or go to Blue Sky, where the one social media channel I like right now, where I post often, and I am at torontomike.com on Blue Sky. If you're still on the Nazi site, please, there's less Nazis at Blue Sky, and you can follow me and we can have a nice conversation there. Much love to all who made this possible. Again, that's Great Lakes Brewery. I'm gonna more beer than this even. I'm gonna load you up here, Alan, with some fresh craft beer from Great Lakes Brewery. Palma Pasta, don't leave without your lasagna, Alan. RecycleMyElectronics.ca. Building Toronto Skyline with Nick Iones from Fusion Corp. And Ridley Funeral Home. See you all tomorrow. Speaking of music, Karen Bliss is my special guest, making her Toronto Mike debut tomorrow. She came up in the Remembering David Farrell episode we recorded with Dave Charles and Richard Flohill. We're going to talk to Karen Bliss. There's a lot of big names, right? Richard Flohill, by the way, still attends like 200 shows a year or something.
It's amazing. He's got to be 90. He's older than me.
He's older than 90. And the only guy who, Dave Hodge is still out there going to a bunch of shows. He turns 80 this year.
Wow.
So there you go. No rest for the wicked. See you all then.